morning, everybody. I'm super excited to welcome Bob Moore, founder and CEO of Crossbeam. Bob, welcome to our podcast today.
Great to be here. Long overdue. We've had so many conversations in private. It's great to have them all over again for the world to see.
And many new things, of course. But before we get started, I'd love to have you take a minute and introduce yourself.
All right. Hey, yeah, I am Bob Moore. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Crossbeam. If you're not familiar with Crossbeam, I'm sure we'll talk about it a bunch, but we're basically the leading platform for helping companies account map with each other. So we help businesses compare their CRM data to figure out where their sales pipelines and customer bases and other things intersect, which turns out to have some really, really interesting applications in the partnership and channel world. Prior to this, I started two other SaaS businesses, one called RJ Metrics and one called Stitch Data. They were both super nerdy data analytics companies that basically helped businesses make better decisions with their own data. So Crossbeam was kind of a logical next business because it helps companies make better decisions with data that's not theirs, that's coming out of their partner ecosystem.
Awesome. So let's go back to your first company. How did you come up with the idea? How did you get started? What happened there?
Yeah, so I'm an engineer kind of by training. So I studied computer science and this weird category of engineering called operations research in college, which is a lot of statistics. And that landed me a job at a venture capital firm called Insight Partners when I graduated college. So I worked at Insight for 2 years on the investment team, really the junior most analyst on the team, just kind of crunching numbers and doing due diligence on new investments. But what I found really quickly was there's just an enormous universe of businesses out there that are wildly successful, but at least at that time were incredibly unsophisticated from an analytics standpoint. And doing things like understanding customer lifetime value and cohort analysis did not come naturally to a lot of these businesses that were kind of growing like weeds, right? So what I did for Insight for many years was help these companies analyze their own data. And I would do that very manually with SQL and Excel pivot tables and a bunch of kind of creative visualization techniques. And the idea for RJ Metrics was basically to productize that work, right? So any business in the world that wanted to have these kind of world-class venture capital grade analytics on their business could do it if they just used our software products. So this is way back in 2008. Quit my job at Insight with a brilliant co-founder by the name of Jake Stein, who also worked there. And we were off to the races starting RJ Metrics. And we built that business for 8 years and really stuck true to that kind of core vision the whole time, right? Like bringing business intelligence to the masses delivered via SaaS, which was kind of novel at the time.
And what about your second company?
Yeah, so Stitch Data, this is one of those things where none of my companies would have existed if not for the company before it, right? So RJ Metrics only existed because of what I observed at Insight. Stitch only existed because of what we observed at RJ Metrics. The Stitch company was actually a spinoff of RJ that was designed to solve a specific problem we ran into at RJ Metrics, which was businesses have their data scattered across an enormous universe of systems of records. So if you're an average e-commerce company, you probably have a shopping cart like Shopify that knows who bought what when. You have an inventory management platform that knows what products you sell. You have a payment and transaction processor that knows about all your refunds that were issued and how the cash is actually flowing in the door. You probably have a marketing platform like a HubSpot or a MailChimp that knows what emails you sent and who opened them and how they converted. You've got ad spend going on with Google and Facebook and all these other places. And it's very, very difficult for end businesses, especially people who are not in the business of analytics, to suck all that data out of all those platforms and get it into one spot. So you can answer questions like, does this marketing campaign result in a lot of refunds, right? You kind of need to connect the marketing campaign across the different campaign providers and the transactions from the e-commerce platform and the payments from the payment platform to process the refunds. These complex business questions require kind of coalescing data from multiple sources. So the idea for Stitch was to just create a very, very easy, intuitive way for companies to take the data out of all these API endpoints across all these services they use and deposit it into one centralized data warehouse. And we came into being around the same time that Amazon Redshift was, the fastest growing data warehouse in Amazon product in AWS history. Snowflake was coming onto the scene, the early days of Databricks as well. And Stitch ended up just becoming this wildly successful product-led growth story because it was very easy to sign up, low friction, free trial oriented, a whole lot of SEO strategies that were super fun to deploy there. But we it kind of got a life of its own really quickly, in a way that at RJ Metrics we had to do a lot more chewing glass to make it work. So Stitch was actually acquired. Talend came along and made us an offer when the company was only about 2 years old. That just made a whole lot of sense for everybody involved, and we ended up selling it in 2018.
That is awesome. And then you came up with the idea of Crossbeam, or you took some sabbatical or some time off?
No, I'm out of my mind. I need therapy. I took very little sabbatical. I actually attempted. I got an Airbnb in Santa Monica and just was like, maybe I want to go to the West Coast. I'm a Philadelphia guy, so I lasted about a month before I was back in Philly, starting the next thing. And look, Crossbeam's the same story, right? The pattern continues. It was because of what we experienced at Stitch that I became obsessed with this Crossbeam problem. Because if you think about what Stitch was as a business, no one buys Stitch because they want Stitch. We are part of the modern data stack. And the reason you buy Stitch is because you already have a Snowflake data warehouse and there's data missing from it, right? And you want to get that data in there. Or you're already using Looker to analyze your data and build dashboards, but there's a missing dashboard that you can't build because the data is missing from the Snowflake data warehouse that it's sitting on top of. People encounter business problems when trying to use other products, and we are something that fits into their stack in order to solve it at Stitch. So what that meant was the number one most highly qualified prospect for us at Stitch was somebody who just bought Snowflake or somebody who was in the sales pipeline to buy Looker. And we realized that the way to collaborate with these partners was through this age-old practice called account mapping, where basically you email spreadsheets back and forth with your partners, kind of playing battleship. Are you working with company X? Are you working with person Y? And it's a very deeply flawed process because you end up sharing a lot of information that you probably wish you didn't share, right? Who's in your sales pipeline that they might not have even known about or been able to help on, or who's a customer that you want to be cautious about sharing their identity that turns out not to overlap. The oversharing problem is an issue. And then there are all these data quality problems where, writing a complicated VLOOKUP in Excel just is not the right tool for the job to figure out if your complicated CRM data actually overlaps or not. And most companies at best are able to do these account mapping processes maybe quarterly. Most companies at scale do them once a year. And the problem with that is that the most interesting account mapping information is extremely ephemerally useful, right? So the fact that my partner just opened an opportunity or just closed a deal is probably the most useful moment in which that information can be used or consumed. But if there's a 1-year lag on the accuracy of that data, then you're missing the majority of this value, right? And to add to that, it's impossible to scale, especially when you have a big ecosystem with a lot of partners. So the vision for Crossbeam was, man, this was painful at Stitch, even though it was the most important motion and it was responsible for the overwhelming majority of our revenue. What if we built a software product that solved that exact problem and basically acted like an escrow service for data? So we could use everything we learned at Stitch about how to pull data out of all these various systems of record and kind of transform it and map it, but also add this new layer where the purpose of the tool is not to analyze your own data, but to actually allow your data to pass through to your partners, but only very specific slices when very specific conditions are met, right? You have ultimate control over who can see what, when, and under what circumstances. And that was really the vision for Crossbeam. It's this escrow service for data. So we implemented that in late 2018, early 2019, and we were kind of off to the races. But that really, I think the most exciting thing and interesting thing is we were smart by accident, because it turns out that the modern data stack was not the only universe where that whole trend was true. It turned out to be this enormously comprehensively accurate trend across virtually all verticals of technology, where buyer mentalities were shifting and they were buying in stacks, in retail tech and cybersecurity and HR tech and education tech, right? Pick your vertical, and the Crossbeam problem existed. So we ended up having this just incredible product market fit right out of the gate, just as a result of that one observation.
So Bob, you and I have spoken about Crossbeam having multiple legs. I'd love to have you take a few minutes to explain what those legs are and how do they come together.
Yeah, absolutely. So the interesting thing about when a company adopts Crossbeam is that we see these very interesting personas that latch onto it at different times in the onboarding. So it's almost always true that it's partnership teams that end up adopting Crossbeam initially because the product is extremely viral. 7 out of every 10 companies that have signed up because they were invited in by another company that was already using it, right? So it's very much kind of this peer-to-peer, almost like LinkedIn for data. That's how people discover it. That's how people collaborate. And because of that, the partnership teams end up being really instrumental because they are kind of the social butterflies, right? They're the connection mechanics. They own the relationships. They're the ones sending invites, kind of setting up the data sharing rules, configuring all of that. But there comes a point in every company's journey where Crossbeam is sufficiently implemented that you've actually unlocked this data layer that in aggregate is maybe the most valuable data resource that your revenue team has. So we end up with this secondary persona that becomes really critical for us, which is the chief revenue officer, sales managers, and ultimate kind of end sellers who look at this ecosystem data not just as a clue to how a partner might help, but as actually an intelligence asset about what is going on with all of the accounts that you care about at all times. And the playbooks are not just, hey, let me call up the partner manager and have them make an intro call with a partner and then we'll do a co-selling thing. That playbook works and you can use it. But there's also this layer of just these signals that exist inside your ecosystem about who is buying what technology at what time, in what order, who the key buyers are that are associated with those buying processes, and how does it relate to your deal that you are pursuing as a sales rep or a sales manager becomes such a powerful source of signal, right? We think of it as second party data. If first party data is who filled out a form on your website and third party is like who left a G2 review, the second party data is proprietary to you, but scales much, much, much better than your first party assets because it's all of the knowledge from all your partners, right? So the sales teams end up becoming this next buyer. And then there's this third leg of the stool, which is kind of the 2x2 matrix of like, if one dimension is partnerships to sales and the other dimension is SMBs to large enterprises, when you get up to sales and large enterprises, when you get up to that upper right quadrant, sales in large enterprises is channel. And what we find is that even if we land with the ISV teams or with the partnership teams kind of on the technology or product side of the business, and we have go-to-market use cases for them, it is inevitable that we end up working with the channel teams because we have this really great footprint and this really great data asset, and it's enabled by and consumed by the direct selling teams. And it's just a very, very logical evolution that it is a great resource for the channel teams as well, and then ends up getting deployed in that way, right? So that's kind of the journey, and those are the personas that we end up working with in nearly all companies of scale.
So let's double click a little bit on the customer experience, right? And maybe the journey also starting with you. So once they sign up with Crossbeam, what do they get? And what process changes do they need to make internally to really leverage that insight that you're bringing in?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the neat thing about our business model is we have this really cool free tier. So anybody that gets invited into the platform by an existing customer does not have to pay anything to sign up, connect their data, define these populations of data, like who are my customers, who are my opportunities, who are the prospects in my key accounts. And what you get right out of the box in the free tier is the ability to do that really fundamental account mapping between your prospects, opportunities, and customers and the prospects, opportunities, and customers of your partner. And we actually allow you to connect with an unlimited number of companies who can then be your partners. And the only limitations are when you start looking at high volumes of data, or you want to export the data to spreadsheets or to other platforms. This is when you start getting into kind of the more paid tiers. But you can get really, really far on our free tier in terms of identifying key overlaps, identifying these, kind of validating the fact that there's significant addressable market that could be well covered or impacted by using these playbooks. So for a lot of companies, they typically join initially on the free tier and then kind of go through this evolution of upgrading to paid tiers to start to access things like porting the data back to CRM systems, or using things like our AI Copilot tool, which it kind of is a ride along for your sales reps that allows them to get a really good summation of the 360-degree ecosystem view on all the accounts that they're working. It's like really kind of fun technology that we've built. So that customer journey just kind of ramps up in a way that actually really nicely follows those personas that I just described, where it's very often partnership team joins the free tier. They tend to upgrade a little bit. Then there's a bigger upgrade when the sales team rolls it out. And each one of these has a bigger and bigger impact and ROI for the underlying business that uses it. So you asked about changes to kind of the way in which companies actually execute on this stuff. And what we generally find is the biggest impact happens when we have the sales team, the sales ops team, and kind of the totality of the go-to-market organization on board, right? If this is something where an isolated partner team on an island is trying to implement it, they will absolutely get value and there's an ROI story, but it will be limited to the things that the partner team primarily cares about. When we start to show up in boardrooms, when we start to show up in board presentations, it's because the CRO is aware and it's because the sales ops team has done work to actually roll this out and do enablement and training across actual sales reps and sales managers. And that's the big leap. And very true for channel too, right? Where you're kind of at the intersection of sales and partnerships.
So let's keep on building on that a little bit. So what, like from a use case perspective, if you take a specific persona on the sales side,
Yeah.
if you take a persona on the partnership management side, like you said, they start on the partnership management side, then rolls over to the sales side. Can
Yeah.
you walk through the specific use cases in both of those personas?
Yeah, I'll give you rapid fire. I'll give you kind of classic tech partnerships. I'll give you direct sales, and then I'll give you channel, right? Maybe a soundbite for each, right? So classic tech partnerships, the bread and butter right down the middle use case is which partners should I actually be spending time with? There's an enormous universe of folks where I could build an integration to their platform, or we could do a co-marketing webinar, or we could just kind of spend time aligning our teams and cross-training our sales teams. So the question is, who's worth it? And this fundamental assessment of how much do our current customer bases already overlap? And when they do overlap, what do those customers look like? Are they our best customers? Do they have the highest ACV? Do they have the lowest churn rates? Is there an inherent property to the center of the Venn diagram between our target market and this partner's target market, where these are fundamentally better and more interesting customers, A, and the center of that Venn diagram is big enough to make it worthwhile to scale that partnership and likely anticipate an increase in pipeline that's going to matter and move the needle for my business, right? So there's kind of this 2x2 of what's the level of impact that this partner can have on one side, and then also what is the actual magnitude of the universe of companies that impact can be applied to. And when you end up, again, I always talk in 2x2 matrices, right? When you end up in that top right quadrant, then you're in this really interesting zone. And that's a framework that most of our customers that are using us within tech partnerships are using to basically qualify, prioritize, and assess the quality of those partnerships and figure out who to work with. And a lot of them are even using it for like the tiering of their partner programs, the classic like silver, gold, platinum style things. Often Crossbeam is both an input and an output, right? It's an input to who gets placed initially in those categories, and then it's an output because the better the category you're in, the more they'll share with you through Crossbeam. So it becomes this really nice closed loop, right? So that's tech partnerships. Within sales, this is so straightforward. Think about your weekly pipeline review that a sales manager does with a sales rep and walking through the deals that are open opportunities with a close date for this quarter and looking at the ones where there are opportunities to accelerate the deal, to potentially sell more products, to increase the ACV by selling a higher tier, by multi-threading, by getting in touch with multiple contacts. These are all motions that data from your partner ecosystem can help enable. Because if you've got 20 open opportunities, you can start with the ones that are stalled, where there hasn't been a response, and you look and see, okay, there's actually, while it's been quiet in our CRM, there's actually been really interesting activity where we know that they are using this very complementary product, and maybe we can make sure that we incorporate the pitch about the integration and how much value it provides as part of what we say. We may notice that a partner of ours that closed a deal there recently was working with a few people inside that target org that you are not working with yet. And you might be able to kind of do a little bit better org mapping and figuring out the key contacts and decision makers because of the intelligence that's coming from your partners who have kind of gone down this road somewhat recently. And generally just sizing up, again, how to prioritize and where to spend time based on how the existing tech stack of or service relationship with these prospects lines up with good outcomes that you've seen in the past, right? And how to figure out if you're part of a stack, then that's the really valuable stack, right? And then in channel, which maybe we can talk about separately, it's about avoiding channel conflict. And whether you are a vendor that's attaching a channel partner to a deal, or you are someone in the channel that's deciding when and whether to register a deal or potentially connect with a vendor on it, getting that earlier visibility higher in the funnel through very selective account mapping just leads to better decisions and less conflict, which is a really powerful thing.
That is amazing. All right, so let's come to the present moment because you kind of described, what you have built and what you're offering. Let's kind of fast forward a little bit, and I'd love to hear from you, especially as you're a data guy, this thing that associated with data now AI.
Yeah.
So when you think about where we are and where we are going, and you have this incredible offer that kind of merges things together to create second party data, how does AI play into this in your vision?
Yeah. So this, I actually genuinely believe that network effects and network effect related businesses are going to be the great differentiator in the AI era because they are the one source of knowledge that is impossible to be replicated by a large language model that has kind of consumed all of the publicly available data that's on the internet. So let's think about those classes of data we talked about before, right? So third party data, like data you might buy from a data broker, or kind of your classic, hey, you pay them tens of thousands a year and you get email addresses and job titles and things like that. Right now, if you look at that industry, it's a huge race to the bottom, right? The AI tools are getting very, very good at either intuiting or literally scraping and identifying this information for pennies on the dollar compared to what it used to cost before. And the mass commoditization of these fundamental like firmographic and contact level information about people is already well underway, right? Like information that is generally publicly available but just hard to uncover is approaching the limit of being free, right? And that makes third party data ultimately very, very commoditized. Now, first party data, which is the data that is not commoditized because it's within your walled garden, right? Only you know who filled out the form on your website. Only you know what sales calls you've had recently. Only you know who's been accessing your product and using it aggressively. However, that data is not inherently greenfield, right? It's always about the folks that you already have captive, that have already filled out that form, that are already using your free product. And the ability to use first party data as a growth engine is very limited to just the internal growth you can create among the captive audience you already have, right? So you can only go so far with your own proprietary first party data. So the holy grail then becomes, what is the data asset that A, is proprietary, meaning that it will not be erased to the bottom. The LLMs will not be able to just scrape it into oblivion. But B is actually actionable, right? In a way that unlocks greenfield, that allows you to find growth channels within your business. And it is this second party data. It's the knowledge that your partners have that they are willing to share with you that checks both those boxes. It's within this very specialized walled garden that is all these Venn diagrams between you and your partners, that only you have your partner ecosystem and only you have access to that data. But it also is greenfield in nature because these partners know things you do not, and therefore they create these vectors of potential action that wouldn't have been available otherwise. So you can think about this. You can make that whole argument without AI, by the way, and just say, hey, this is an amazing asset for sales teams. And the reason the data is valuable, where AI comes into play, is that these AI agents and AI co-pilots and all of these kind of systems that are aggregating knowledge and intelligence, they too are a race to the bottom in that they will only be as good as the context that you can provide them. And the differentiation, I think we're already at a point where the underlying base LLM model is kind of interchangeable between, a small universe of very, very large vendors that are really on the bleeding edge of kind of the power of these models. So the question is, what can you put in the context model, the context window of that agent that will actually allow it to be more informed, to make smarter decisions around who to contact, how to contact them, how to message, what it means to follow up, what success looks like, how to prioritize and how to execute. And the second party data is actually that holy grail that pulls it all together. So I think the intersection of the partnerships work and the AI work is this beautiful, beautiful match that we're really only starting to tap into.
So let me ask you one thing.
Yeah.
Over the last couple of years, especially over the last 6 months or so, we're seeing various types of models, inference engines that are being released.
Yeah.
And also what we're seeing is there's a greater degree focus to improve the accuracy. So release of, RAGs and CAGs, and
Yeah.
Claude introduced MCP model just to contain this runaway child that tends to hallucinate and go off different direction.
Yeah.
So in the near term, do you think despite all the discussion around AI based on LLMs or even LQMs, are the systems going to stay mostly CRUD based? And when it comes to content related, people will plug in some LLMs because the infrastructure needs to evolve for a bit, or you see applications even now that you can plug in LLM into some sort of a quasi CRUD plus infrastructure to really get or provide more definitive answers from a data perspective.
Yeah, I think this is where the systems that are very focused on RAG or kind of the MCP platforms become really, really powerful because they are the nexus between CRUD and the LLMs, right? So um, we're getting pretty good at like weeding out the hallucinations stuff. Some of these reasoning models, like even at just what OpenAI has been able to do with some of the models where they basically have their own models gut checking the results of themselves, right? By spawning up multiple instances of themselves, farming out micro tasks, reconsolidating it, and kind of logic checking the result. In my personal use of these platforms, I feel like the rate at which there have been just patently false information or hallucinated information has gone down pretty considerably as the kind of intermediary fact checking of the models on the models has actually gotten better and better. But then you come back to the same exact problem, which is okay. There's hallucinations, but then there's also just like usefulness and accuracy. Like there comes a point where, sure, if I want to ask an LLM about the War of 1812, it's going to be brilliant and it can write me a term paper. But if I want to ask it about sales call that I just got off of and to contextualize that around all the activities that have gone on with this account across my product and my sales call recordings and my CRM data from the last 3 months. If I go to ChatGPT right now and type that in, it's going to have nothing to tell me because it can't see any of that data. It's kind of like Stitch, my old company, right? Like this universe of distributed sources of truth need to be reconciled into one spot where you can create that context window I was talking about. And I think like I'm less concerned about hallucinations as kind of a zone of concern. What I think is more interesting is the infusion of facts into that context window that are inherently proprietary. And these RAG platforms are kind of like the Stitch data of the future, right? And MCP is kind of like a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. I'm watching what Zapier is doing in that space. We're doing some internal work with their tools currently that's super fun. But at the end of the day, it really is just it's kind of old school data pipeline and software engineering, but the end destination, instead of it being a Snowflake data warehouse or Amazon Redshift, you're dropping it into a context that these models can then consume kind of ad hoc that's scoped appropriately for the problem they're trying to solve. And what's old is new again, right? But it feels eerily familiar given my past.
So I want to ask you from a second party data wise and application of AI,
Yeah.
do you think in your mind the challenge is the same because data is data, or when it comes to first party, third party, or second party data, is it harder or easier to apply these some of the models that are available today from the infrastructure companies?
Yeah, I would say that in a classic software engineering universe, you can make a really good argument that it's significantly harder to apply second party data because of the dimensions on which it scales. Right? So first party data is like what do you have? You have customers, you have website visitors, you have like maybe buying signals that can all be kind of crammed into one data model. Third party data, it's like, okay, well, I've got metadata, right? It's like, what's this person's email address and their job title and maybe how recently they took that job. When you get into second party data, it's nested, right? It's like, okay, I have a universe of 40 partners, and this account is an account that is known by 7 of those partners. So how do you nest and organize that data? Do you have a big blob where it shows up 7 times nested under each one, or do you organize it by the account and then the partners are nested under it? And then how do you build software platforms that can then retrieve and parse that data through both of those lenses? Because sometimes you might be curious about the partner and what it can bring to you in total. Sometimes you might care about the account and how many partners are attached to it. So there's all of these challenges around the organization and structuring of that data that makes traditional software engineering for second party data more complex and more challenging of a problem. And actually, it maps really well to like our use cases for partnerships and use cases for sales are basically exactly what I just described, right? Are you assessing a partner or are you assessing an account? Same data, different organization structure, which means different interfaces, which means different database structures, which means different query optimizations. It's complicated. What I think the LLMs are proving really, really good at is being able to receive a either unstructured or incorrectly structured payload of that data, localized to the specific question that's being asked, and being able to reorganize that on the fly themselves without requiring a more deterministic data structuring process in the back end. Now, if your data set gets absolutely enormous, there comes a point where that's wildly inefficient and the LLMs are the wrong tool for the job. But if you're talking about a few hundred accounts spread out across a few dozen partners and maybe 100 signals or data points per account, you can just throw that payload into an LLM and it can iterate on and transform that data in a rapid enough time frame that you can unlock immense flexibility and value creation without needing to custom program every single possible use case or output. And that in that way, I think that LLMs are actually making the second party data much more accessible and flexible and kind of a bigger part of the picture going forward.
So, Bob, do you think from an application wave wise, if we kind of think through next 12, 18, 24 months horizon, are we going to see application of sort of AI models in the second party data where things are broad? Like I have 5 marketing use cases, 5 sales use cases, 5 CS, 5 product use cases. Are we going to see deep? Like I have 500 campaigns,
Yeah.
I have 5,000 calls. Like which direction do you think it will go to have address 3 issues, right? One is accuracy.
Yeah.
Second thing is predictability with a narrower range, right?
Mhm.
Because it will possibly end up giving a range. And then scalability, how much can it translate above and beyond what it knows, right? So if you have to think on those 2 dimensions, where do you think the first set of applications are going to be, horizontal or vertical?
Yeah. So, and I think a question behind the question there is this going to be led by what the technology is good at, or is it going to be led by what end users actually want and need and what they might be willing to consume? And I tend to prefer to think about it through the latter lens because you can likely kind of fit these technologies or some combination of these technologies and more classic methods to solve for either one. In our experience and in our view in testing products out in the market, we tend to find that a more bottoms up approach where you start with these kind of atomic units on which you might take action and then build up into strategies and campaigns from there is significantly more effective a use of the LLMs than starting with a concept for a playbook that might be run and then asking it to pull together the pieces down below. So a more specific example of that would be the way that our Deal Navigator product works. If you're a sales rep and you log into Crossbeam and you go to Deal Nav, you are looking at every single account that is in your book of business that you own, and it is being dynamically prioritized by a combination of deterministic and AI powered kind of scoring algorithms to tell you where there's interesting action, where there's an interesting next step to take, and kind of the state of play from an ecosystem standpoint on all of your accounts. And the way that that works is that we have work that gets done on every single individual account atomically, and the LLMs that are kind of doing some of that analysis, they're situationally aware of these bigger picture pre-calculated values, like which of your partners perform the best, where do you get the best outcomes, some of these higher order bits around what makes for an interesting deal. Those are kind of inputs. But then what you're doing is analyzing thousands and thousands of accounts really, really rapidly through the lens of all of that localized walled garden context about what partners matter and who can move the needle for you. And what you get out the other end is an ability to score and prioritize and tell stories about and recommend actions on every single individual account. The LLMs, very, very atomic there. Like they're being given finite discrete inputs and they are making assessments and scores, but then you use more classic software engineering methods to roll all of that up into a singular view that human beings know how to consume, and that can provide that really interesting thing, right? So what you end up with is this very big strategy, which is every single sales manager looking at ecosystem data in every single weekly pipeline review and in pursuing every single account, but it's an outgrowth of applying the LLMs atomically at the individual account level. That's kind of where we are and where we're starting and what we think is the best tool for the job for where to plug that in right now.
That's amazing. So I want to double click a little bit of the discussion you and I have had for our common customers and coming from Crossbeam perspective or Zinfi perspective. We do workflow automation. We're very much trying to provide an alternative to Salesforce, not replacing it, but augmenting it.
Mm-hmm.
You also connect to Salesforce. We have talked about, instead of connecting each other, connecting through Salesforce.
Yeah.
So customer has a unified, way to look at their data and then also manage activities on the partner side, like partner onboarding, partner enablement, co-marketing, co-sell, etc. So talk to me a little bit. I know you and I have spoken, so I'll leave it to you how much you want to talk in publicly. But where do you think the intersections are between Crossbeam and workflow automation tools like PRMs, like Zinfi and others?
Yeah, well, it's funny. We're both friendly with Jay McBain, right, at Canalys, and I over the years, it's been fun to watch his research evolve around how he thinks and talks about organizing the technology products that help channel teams and partnership teams and sales teams go to market. And one of the discussions that I've had with him and I've had with you is, the latest rendition of that is these islands of technology tools that all they have bridges between each other, and you've got different platforms for PRM and kind of classic partner onboarding and management and lead referrals. And then you've got account mapping platforms like Crossbeam that unlock these data layers and connect you to sales teams. And then, yeah, you've got folks that manage the marketplaces with the hyperscalers, and you've got people that manage MDF funds and affiliate payments and things like that. There are all these different corners of the market. And, I'm increasingly viewing it not as a bunch of islands connected by bridges, but as a stack, right? And in the same way, 8 years ago at Stitch, we were talking about the modern data stack and the way that people buy these technology products, not just because they peacefully coexist, but because they actually augment each other sufficiently enough to be worth more than the sum of their parts. And I think this is where we are with platforms like Zinfi and platforms like Crossbeam, right? These two things are a 1+1=3 story, not because there's some kind of profoundly deep product integration. Like a lot of where the data can coexist and interact could actually be in Salesforce as that primary location, that primary system of record. The thing is, what can your company implement in terms of a end-to-end playbook, because these solutions are implemented in the same place at the same time? And when you think about all the value stories I just told you about Crossbeam and being able to prioritize your partners, prioritize your deals that you're working on, customize the way you approach those deals, enlist the right channel partners when necessary, think about layering that on as a force multiplier on top of all of the incredible work that you can do in terms of collaborating with those partners and kind of going through the actual workflows of bringing those partnerships to life, investing in them, training those partners, executing on deals together that live inside of platforms like Zinfi, right? So when you have these two things coexist, you start to get into a place where you are running a significantly more strategic and comprehensive strategy. And there's this smoothness to how they interact as opposed to them just happening to both be there. So I think that stack is probably not just 2 layers; it's probably a 5-layer cake or a 6-layer cake. And looking at the world through that lens makes it really exciting for end users and customers in this space, along with for folks like you and me who get to figure out how to collaborate.
Yeah, and maybe we can share a little bit because it's still at an ideation stage, and then you and I have to execute that. But if we think about CRM platforms, and maybe we pick 3 simple ones, they're large, vast, and relatively uniform.
Yeah,
Salesforce for enterprise, Dynamics for enterprise, and HubSpot for mid-market. So if
yeah,
we take those 3, both have large reservoir of data, marketing, sales, CS, and etc.
hmm
So if we look at Crossbeam as a data orchestration engine, and if we look at someone like us for workflow orchestration engine,
yeah,
you're going to provide the insight to who to go after, why to go after, how to put the solutions together, where the opportunities are, what you call signals,
yeah,
sensing and signals, right?
hmm
And once you know that, right, if we can build something together where the action that you take, you don't have to manually go in there, and workflow orchestration platform, right,
hmm
take that insight and sends a notification out. Partner comes in and collaborates on a deal, or a third party alliance partner through a second party data
hmm
comes in, launches a promo, or pays out certain points because there's joint marketing campaigns that happen because it's a point accrual system, right? So because the whole purpose of automation, which you talked about earlier, is to bring in scale, right? Scale at large and simplify very, very complex workflows and data insights. So using that as a framework, talk to me a little bit about a partnership from Crossbeam perspective. What does it look like? Yes, you and I have spoken to Jay. He talks about these 7 layers.
yeah.
What are the obvious layers to you in your mind to come together around the Crossbeam data orchestration engine?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it gets super meta because it's partnership people talking about partnerships between partnership people to make people's partner programs more partnerly, right? It's like,
Right. Awesome. So we're kind of coming to an end. I know you have to go, but I do want to take a couple of minutes and talk about 2 things.
sure,
One is, Bob Moore today, looking back at Bob Moore in 2008, if you have to give one advice, like all the things that you'll learn starting up businesses, what would that be? And then the second part is, if a Bob Moore is going to talk to the Bob Moore for 20 years out, what wisdom are you going to look for?
Yeah, I mean, look, talking to myself in the past, I have a hard time with this because I always talk about entrepreneurship as just being kind of the combination of scar tissue and muscle memory, and like knowing the difference between which is which. And I think a lot of the things that I feel like I kind of have figured out have only become that mature because I have fallen on my face so many times in those categories and kind of become obsessed with caring more about them. Right. So I think the thing I probably would tell myself is just keep surrounding yourself with all of the most ambitious possible people who are like-minded and who have very very low egos the whole way through, right? And I have always found that, you know, I've collaborated with some of the best co-founders in the startup universe over the years. I've been really fortunate to do that. Jake Stein, Buck Ryan, now Simon Boucher from the former CEO of Reveal, who's the co-founder in Crossbeam now. um, these folks keep me grounded and kind of like encourage me to be ambitious when the time is right, but kind of check my thinking when I'm wrong. And I think it's, if you can find great collaborators, whether they're co-founders or fellow executives or anything else, it will just rapidly accelerate your path to making good decisions and developing that muscle memory while accumulating fewer scars along the way. It's like I'm really a big believer in the people around you do so much to shape who you become and whether or not you're successful. Um, and I don't know, a lesson for me 20 years from now is probably like, you know, look out for the cyborg revolution that's going to come for all of us, right? I think there's like the AI stuff is really fun to be working on right now. Really complex to think about what it'll look like in 5 years, and probably downright earth shattering to think about what it'll look like in 10 or 20 years. And I'm less forecasting any kind of doomsday, you know, Skynet scenarios, and more so just saying like maybe everything we know is wrong about how we exist as humans on this planet, what happy and successful life looks like, how to spend time and energy, how to invest in learning and skills and being good at something that is of value to humanity. I think a lot of these things are going to kind of undergo paradigm shifts in the next couple of decades. And I'm not smart enough to see around the corners and exactly how, but I think it's going to be very, very worth paying attention and trying to be at least 2 steps ahead of the average Joe as that's going down.
Well, with that amazing note, Bob, I want to thank you for being here today. We got to get back in 6 months, do another maybe pulse check call to see
Yeah,
where things are at because things are moving so fast. But I sincerely thank you for being here and sharing your journey, sharing your vision, and
amazing. It's been
sharing some
super
of your.
fun.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a good
Thanks.
one.